The first question I would really like to ask, and that's to the port and to Bibby, really, is on the collaboration side. Nigel, if you go first. On the collaboration side, you as organisers of your company see lots and lots of companies engaged. What's your message for the shipbuilding team as to how you orchestrate a nationwide approach to that?
It's a big old question, isn't it?
I know it's a big old question. Matt, you're next, so you've got the
One of the things I didn't really touch on in my presentation is our desire as whilst we're a British shipbuilder owner-operator, we actually want to see British shipbuild back in the UK because of the size of the prize and the opportunity. Now, clearly there's been other people take a steal on this, but through the energy transition and through the ability to build new best-in-class and world-leading technology, pretty much tapping into everybody's discussions earlier, we believe there's a moment in time where we can almost, it fits nicely with the grey build strategy and the 30-year pipeline, but we can see there's a moment in time where there's a great opportunity where UK shipbuilding can actually start to fund not just its own UK content, which I think the numbers are now 60%, but actually become an exporter of best-in-class, clean SOV or offshore wind support vessels. So how that then interlinks with the port really is customers want, in many respects, they want an end-to-end solution. So they don't want you to come and say, you built me a great big clean vessel, but then we pull into your port and lo and behold, you can't recharge and you've created a customer headache. So the two are intrinsically linked. But back to the point on the actual linking into shipbuilding, there is a pivotal point here where if we get this right, there'll be a great opportunity to create jobs, as we were discussing in Orkney, far greater than it is for us as a single ship operator. But the UK can become a net exporter of clean maritime assets, which for me, you talk about purpose and desire, that's doing the right thing and getting greater benefit for the UK economy.
Thank you. Matt, do you want to just finish off on that?
Yeah, I think in order to answer that question, I'll probably go back to 2019 and why we opened the Innovation Hub. And that was because some of the challenges that we have right around maritime, not least of which imports, are too big to solve. Either whether that's one ports group or one shipping organisation. And I think previously people have looked at jumping advantage and taking advantage of new technologies quick. But we're not in that situation anymore. You know, the change that needs to happen in maritime and in ports is so vast that we can't afford to go on our own anymore. And so it's essential that we work together, because otherwise, in trying to develop our own IPR, we're not going to get the solutions right. And I mean, the Innovation Hub was formed because with Nissan originally, because we were trying to figure out how cars can drive themselves from the facility to the port and then onto an autonomous vessel and sail away. And then the more people that we talked to, the more of these kind of industry problems we realized that we had. If we take shore power specifically, there's a lot of things happening in ports, whether that's through our port into the British Ports Association or UK Major Ports Group, but we can't do it without everybody else involved. And I mean, is this live streamed or anything?
Yeah, no, it's not.
I'd happily use the Maritime Innovation Hub to try and bring some of these parts together and in a facilitated session to see how we go about it, because the problem's huge. For us as a port individually, it's knowing what technology we go with for a start, and then how we capitalize that. You know, lots of these ports are small and they invest with working capital, and they don't have the working capital to do that. And when we've looked around the world, there's not a single port in the world that's managed to do this without some kind of assistance or subsidy or grant. So it is a big problem. Like I say, I'd extend the Innovation Hub invitation to anybody who wants to get involved and see how we try and map this forward.
That's brilliant. Rex, well, I can't see where Rex is. He gone? Or John Howie? Still in the audience? No? Lost? Can't see them. No. At the back. Would you like to just comment on that at all? I'm sorry to drag you back into the panel, but I think it's quite important to do the linkage.
Yeah, so absolutely. On the first question, I took the brief all, and we're really keen to see how we can help. That's exactly the vision of the strategy and how we take forward. The government has set out its pipeline, but there's a whole greater world out there. It's not just about government vessels. And on the second point, one of the issues that the strategy gets after is how do we take this forward? You know, we've just had a spending review, we've had money allocated by the Treasury. I don't see that as the end. I see that as having advanced the baseline further down the solution. And if we demonstrate we can use that funding, which will be announced in the strategy and by our cross-government colleagues shortly, we can then leapfrog to the next step, the next SR, which is in 2.5 years' time. So how do we use the funding and getting on to those opportunities now to generate more investment in 2.5 years' time? So it's a perpetual, absolutely.
Thank you very much. A question from the floor now. I think it's Keir Cravel. What key technologies, for the panel, for the whole panel actually, what key technologies do you envisage being retrofitted? He's just taking it into the merchant vessels. And which ones do you think will lead the field? So anyone want to lead on that? Why don't we look at Oric first?
So what key technology is going into vessels? I think I would look at that piece about how the vessels bunker and how they charge. The technology is already there for the power systems on board. It's a question of how you charge or bunker your vessel in the much more difficult situation that you find at sea. Within my talk, I was looking specifically at offshore renewables, but there's no reason why that sort of technology can't be used at large platforms and substations to really be a catalyst for the wider maritime industry. And as soon as you've got that ecosystem there, just as we've seen in the automotive sector, where initially people were very concerned about range anxiety with their cars, you're going to suddenly get rid of that anxiety for vessels, and people are going to be able to spec their vessels for that sort of wider opportunity to refill, bunker in the field.
I think, if it's okay, just to add to that, I totally agree with what David said. I think the other interesting technology, because the question was specifically about retrofit, so the other, I think, highly interesting technology, well, there's two. Battery is clearly one. I think the other, though, is hydrogen, but with internal combustion fuel mix. We've seen the likes of CMB Tech bringing a first-of-a-kind hydrogen CTV to the market, which is roughly speaking, I think, 80-20 fuel mix. And the ability for it to be used as a retrofit technology is, I think there's very high compatibility there. I think the challenge is, you know, that we've seen at the coalface engaging with vessel operators, wind farm operators, it's just that levelized cost of fuel. It just cannot compete currently, hydrogen, on a price per kilo basis with MGO. So that's the challenge to address.
No, I'm reminded, though, of a presentation by the wind industry a few years ago, quite a lot of years ago, but Neil was telling me about when they said they were going to get their price down to, I think it was £100 per megawatt. The whole room fell about laughing, and they're now down at 50. So nothing ventured, nothing gained springs to mind. Just before we get off this subject, Nigel, do you want to just talk about how you're going to solve the problem? Because you outlined about 4 or 5 different technologies. You're going to have sort of space to change from the diesels in and put other sorts of propulsion in. Is that roughly where you're going?
Yeah, pretty much there's this transition piece. So there'll be the existing assets. We'll look at what fuels we can use, and one of them which would be hydrogen injection. So at the moment, you're just chasing out carbon where you can, not to the point of zero. And part of that will be a hybrid battery solution, and things that you can change, dare I say, relatively cost effectively and relatively easily. As you get into the next iteration of the vessels will be built with that. The whole design premise of the vessel will be the ability to change when you can actually see a cost-effective winning solution. So right now we talk about, when we did the study, we've looked at 3 or 4 fuels, 1 or 2 fit our application, a couple of which won't fit our application, but the learnings are still useful for other industries. So I mean, when we talk about power consumption, our vessels are small when you consider versus a cruise ship. So the thought of 3 or 4 cruise liners pulling up at one of the major ports and wanting to plug in for shore power, it's fine, but you'll have power outages in other part of London. So it's fascinating by the actual the amount of power that these things use, and it will be over time. You'll end up making small incremental gains whilst looking for that step change. But I think the step change will come in the new build. You'll have incremental gains, be it hydrogen and other ways of reducing carbon along the way, and then during that retrofit stage, you'll make a step change.
Neil, do you want a quick burst on that?
Yeah, if I could, just a little piece. Because we've been making hydrogen, we've been trying to find things to do with it. And we've got involved in a series of projects, one of which was really thwarted by regulation about putting hydrogen into an existing diesel engine. And the problem we had was very much the regulatory inertia, I think, to actually be allowed to do things that's slightly different. So putting hydrogen into a diesel engine, it was very clear that that wasn't going to be allowed because we couldn't get the original engine manufacturer to certify and say it was okay. And you go, well, we're trying it on a really old engine. We just want to see if this works and what's the practicalities of the bunkering, of the handling, all the rest of it. But we couldn't fight our way through the regulatory thicket. So we are involved in the Clean Maritime competition, one of the projects on the go at the moment. But that too, I think we're struggling with trying to get through some of the regulatory processes and the time available with the funding that's then also provided by government. So there's a sort of a degree of one hand giving and the other hand taking away, and the momentum that the regulators need to move at, I think, needs to change. And I speak as somebody who used to be a regulator at the Environment Agency, so I'm not in any sense criticising regulation. It's just we are going to have to up our game to allow the rate of iteration that's going to be needed to enable us to discharge these obligations, or these opportunities we can see in front of us.
I think that's right. I mean, I can add my own experience in composite material and also in tidal and also consents. Regulation is, of course, absolutely right, but actually the way regulation is controlled centrally within the government is very tricky because actually the minister in charge is the man working for work and pensions. And so he doesn't have the same impact. He's looking at the safety aspects rather than the impact on the industry. And I think that's one area, certainly in my experience, where we have to actually look not just at the industry, but actually how government manage regulation as well. But yeah.
Yeah, I think there's another point here, and it's probably highlighted as in us all individually talking about our constituent parts. But whilst we might be big infrastructure assets, certainly, you know, ship owners and ports and everybody in between, we're only one small link in a long chain of things that need to happen. And that's the tricky bit here, is getting everybody, all of those links to align. And I think the pivot point, as you quite rightly put it, is now. The other complication is these constituent parts, these links in the chain, go right across lots of government departments. And it requires government to think very, very joined up as well. And actually, you know, the strategies that they have in place are fantastic, but still isolated. You know, it's time for this to be pulled together in some way, shape or form. And that's why collaboration is the only way through it.
Absolutely. Now I'm going to go out to the audience in case there's anybody who hasn't got the app downloaded. Any questions in the audience before? I've got a couple of really good questions on the app up here. Any hands? Yes, there. Yes, Rex.
Can I just come back on the regulation point from the panel? No, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. There's absolutely something that the NSO can help you with. We have a convening authority which goes all the way to ministers. And you said, you know, a minister from a
Work and pensions.
work and pensions getting involved. We can get those ministers together in a room and have a really fruity discussion, as I described it earlier.
Yeah.
So come to us, we need the evidence to be able to challenge. That's what's different.
Yeah. And of course we've got the MCA on the stage later on, so some of these questions, actually he's avoiding coming up, but we can tease him with a couple of these questions at the end if necessary. And the next question I've got, actually let's bring the role of autonomous systems in, and this is from Emma Johnson. How do you see the role of autonomous systems and vessels affecting the offshore renewable market now and in the future? Can I have a volunteer for the first go at that? That's pretty...
I can talk about the vessel side, and if you guys
Okay,
talk about the
right.
industry. And Rex, I'll pick back up on that point, if I may, because to your point, this is big system thinking, and by its nature, it does spread across multiple departments in government, and it's larger than any one individual to map this out, so it does need that big system thinking. But just on the autonomous phase, prior to being in the O&M phase, I used to be in the offshore survey phase, and right now there's people laying steel for 80-metre autonomous survey inspection vessels. So that's a relatively big bet. And in actual fact, if you fast forward to the future, these things will probably be operated and sending data back via CubeSats and processing almost live, which is fantastic. The space in which we operate primarily as it stands today, we technicians to work on assets at sea, and by their very nature, it needs a person, ideally male and female, above board the offshore turbine to do the job at hand. Increasingly over time, as robotics come into play in some of those applications, by default, the individuals are likely to stop on the vessel and do it in a remote application. And over time, you'll see some of those jobs be done onshore. So autonomous systems will play a part in future vessel design. They'll come at different stages through the process of the build. So at the front of a offshore wind farm, really you're actually collecting some geophysical, but you're collecting lots of data, and data by its very essence, you don't need anybody to be in the room to collect it. At the back end, in terms of the build phase, you'll always have a human element to it, and then in the O&M phase, over time, that'll be morphed into what can be reduced to being aboard the vessel or onshore will be, but you'll always have some human interaction, I believe, in the offshore wind side, which will then impact the size of the vessel to some degree, albeit seakeeping states fundamental to those. So.
I'm going to move on to the next question unless there's burning interjection. The next question has come from Mark Bruce. UK has yet to build an SOV. Do you believe there is a market for the UK shipbuilding to pursue, and given the very tight margins that exist for operators? Who should we go? I think probably I'm going to go to BMT. Noel first.
No I think there is, but I think that there's a path to get there, and I think that's the big element. And I think we need to, as I was kind of referring to earlier, I think we need to build on the knowledge we've got within the sector, but also then the larger build knowledge we've got of other vessels. And there's a transition to get there. I mean, we can't necessarily go from designing a wind farm support vessel to tomorrow designing an SAV that is, as you say, Mark, in terms of compatible or competitive, on the global stage. But I think there's steps to get there, and that's what we need to start on those steps today to be able to then have a chance within the future.
Yeah,
I just add to that. I think thinking about what the question was, should the UK pursue it given tight margins and lack of experience? I suppose my challenge back would be, it really depends what as a system we're trying to achieve. So individual companies will obviously have to prioritise bottom line, but systemically we've got the shipbuilding strategy, we've got a desire to be a first mover into clean maritime technology and therefore to kind of grow a market, grow the skills base and capability that can export. And I suppose that's why the shipbuilding strategy is taking a 30-year view. So there are two competing sets of demands here. On an individual contract, can we build competitively? Maybe not. There's a roadmap to that, as you say. But systemically, we've surely got to challenge ourselves. If we believe the projections for clean maritime market growth out to 2050, and we accept the premise that UK offshore wind is a really good place to start, gives us a unique competitive advantage to be able to move into that space, then we have to challenge ourselves to put the pieces in place.
Neil's bursting to say something.
To answer the question, we've got to get into this. Noel, did you say there were no construction vessels in offshore wind? That's a disgrace. It's an absolute bloody disgrace. We should be right in there.
There are some issues from my own experience in various sectors, and the first one is cost of capital. So unless there is a clear government policy which says that's where we're going to go over the next 30 years, not that's how I get re-elected in 4 years, then actually it's very hard to attract investors, and we've spotted this in tidal. There was a question about tidal, and I'll answer that if you like, and Neil can perhaps correct me. But the whole problem with tidal was the cost of capital. And of course, once the government stopped support to tidal in 2016, all our capital dried up. We had a 20% investor, et cetera, et cetera. But now, last November, when the government said, this is our policy in the auction round 4 for the next contract for difference, we're going to have 200 million, and that's going to provide 35 megawatts, all of a sudden we're inundated with potential investors. And I think it applies to this. This is a new market. And the second principle, I think, in this is an economic principle, in that everyone needs an incentive for carrying out an action. And so these investors won't come in unless they know there's a long-term plan for it. And Neil, so do you want to add to that? And then we can come to the rest of the panel.
I was just going to take that a bit further and say we can't maybe get into SOVs. We can't sort of perhaps build 1 or 2 SOVs over the next few decades. If we're going to do it, we need to do it properly. Shipyards need to know that the people they're training up are going to be employed for many years to come. People putting in capital need to know this is not just a one-off. We need to have that whole supply line. So there needs to be some sort of market indication that this is part of our long-term strategy. And if we do, great. I think it's a really great opportunity.
Any other points from the panel?
Just picking up on government aspirations to move from a low-cost or a low-wage industry to a higher-wage industry. This sector allows that. I think the maritime average salary is 35,000, 36,000. There's an opportunity here to build a new sector that gives longevity of jobs, feeds into lots of other industries as well. So it ticks lots of boxes along the way. And I go back to the holistic view of we're trying to become a clean nation. We're trying to be energy specific, dependent. This actually fits in the strategy. It's taken a step further back to that, actually ties into shipbuilding strategy, which hopefully we'll never need to call on, but you'd like to have the ability to scale up warships if you ever needed to. So it does have a big impact on an island nation. I think there's a great opportunity.
Neil, and then...
Just adding to that, the UK innovation strategy, I flashed up the cover to it in the presentation. That clearly sets out that the UK wishes to become what they term as an innovation superpower. There are aspirations to spend 2.4% of GDP on innovation. We're at about half that at the moment. So there is a huge innovation opportunity that government has recognised that is a mechanism by which the UK will carve out its future space in the trading environment. And this, to my mind, looks like exactly the space we could go after. Because we know, as a maritime nation, we have the capabilities to do a lot of this. We know the energy is around our waters. We have certain sovereign rights around that. We certainly have sovereign needs for our own energy security. It's this whole thing about if not us, then who? And if not now, then when? And like you say, we've got to get after this and get into it seriously. It's time to muscle up and just do this.
Yeah, if I can say probably something, it's probably quite controversial, I guess. In other industries, when we've talked about UK content, I can talk for the ports industry specifically. Usually we see that as a breath. We take a big, deep breath and think, great, then we can charge what we want. We still have to commit to doing things better, cheaper, more efficient, and that's something that we need to grasp as a maritime industry. Just because we say UK built doesn't mean that we can rest on our laurels. We still need to push efficiency and effectiveness and, like you say, cost of capital, and they're things that we're not concentrating on at the moment. It feels as though everybody's saying, well, 60% of this has to come to the UK. It doesn't disregard us from our commitments, and that's something that we really need to be careful of.
And it strikes me this is a new market. And new market, you can't have competition until the market is established. So we have to be really careful about a kind of Thatcher policy that all you new companies have got to compete like mad. Actually, in the early stage, when you set up a market, you need that market to develop, then you have competition. And that's another thing that Tidal has suffered from in the past. Any questions from the floor? Yes, there's one on the floor there. Yes, please.
Paul Stott from Newcastle University. I'd just like to make a comment. It's not just about the shipbuilders. You have to understand how shipbuilders compete. And a big part of that is the supply chain and control of the supply chain. You don't go to Nissan, buy one of their cars and say, oh, by the way, I want a Mercedes-Benz So how did Australia clean up on the twin-hull aluminium fast ferry market? There's standards. You don't go and say, I want this type of engine on my ferry. If you don't want this ferry with this engine and these systems, go and buy it somewhere else. And you won't because it's cheap. So we can't just say it's about the shipyards. It's about the entire supply chain. And when we design them, we have to be designing standards with standards systems, so they have to be designed in conjunction with the supply chain in the first place. That's how shipbuilders compete. That's how Korea competes. They compete because they have volume and because they control with an iron contract the makers list. You cannot deviate from their supply chain that supplies them 80 main engines a year. I want a Wärtsilä engine, don't go and buy it somewhere else, you can't have it. So it's not just about the shipyards.
Thank you. Anyone want to come back? No? We're running out of time now, conscious that I want to try and finish on time or I shall get red carded. The one we haven't touched on is Jordan Thomas has said, how important a role will uncrewed surface vessels play in the decarbonising of the maritime sector? And I'm going to... There's no point in hiding, Noel. You're coming first. I know, have you noticed they've all avoided my eyes when a difficult question comes up?
I'll talk to
Noel.
that
Go on,
a little
you
bit
start
in
and
terms
I'll
of...
jump in.
Oh, sorry.
No, go, please.
In terms of decarbonisation, I guess one of the essential things when we talked about things like range of these zero-emission fuels, how fast you go will ultimately depend how far you can go. And when you've got crew on board, you want to get there quickly. You're paying the wages. As soon as you look at uncrewed vessels, yes, there are times they need to transit quickly, but actually by slowing down the vessels, which many uncrewed vessels already do, you don't need as much energy. You can really reduce your energy usage and really bring some of those zero-emission fuels into a more viable prospect.
No, you're on.
No, indeed. And I think, I mean, when I spoke about earlier, we spoke about range and endurance in terms of that impact on fuel. And like you say, that's one of the major advantages of uncrewed vessels as we go forward. And I think, I mean, we're only starting on the applications for them. I think we're starting to see that, but that's only going to build as we start to really understand and learn what they can do and what the art of the possible is. And I think we're only touching on the surface of that at the moment. So that will continue to evolve very quickly, I think, as we start to get these in the water and in operation.
I think we're almost there. I've got one more question. This is for Oric. How does 60%, from Patrick Carney, how does 60% target content, UK target content, compare with the current level of UK content in the offshore wind?
Good question. Put me on the spot. I think we're about sort of 40-45% UK content currently, so you know quite a big gap to close. Interestingly, there is a consultation currently live on UK content plans and the link to CFD, seeking the views of stakeholders as to whether there should be almost a kind of ratcheting up, if you like, of the ability of government to sort of be a bit stricter and some recourse if those supply chain plans are not strictly adhered to. So I think this is clearly something government has an eye on, and there is a gap to close.
I think as we're coming to the end, I'll answer for Neil as well. I can see him burning to answer this, but actually we don't want to fall into the same trap in tidal. I think first mover advantage is incredible. We've got 80%. We're already getting foreign companies sniffing around, trying to come in and manufacture. We've got to grab the opportunity, and risk-averse support is not the best way to go. Ultimately, you get a cheaper product, perhaps in the early years, but then you lose the market.
Absolutely.
And I think the Chinese are brilliant at capturing the market and then raising their prices. So we've got to be a little more agile, I think, in our approach. And that probably concludes this morning's efforts before anybody yellow cards me. And I'd just like to say, could you possibly give the traditional thanks to the panel who've been giving some brilliant presentations.